MIDI. MIDI. Musical Instrument Digital Interface. Did you get that? Musical Instrument Digital Interface. MIDI. MIDI. So, what is this musical instrument digital interface that I'm talking about? Well, once you take a moment and contemplate in your head, what do you think MIDI is? Many of you likely consider it to be some sort of instrument or sound synthesizer that creates otherworldly sounds, aggressive, complex leads, etc. And although MIDI might be behind the ability to create these sounds, by itself, it's much more boring than that. It's actually just a communication protocol. It's a specification for how to package, format, and deliver data from one place to another so that two MIDI capable devices can communicate with each other. Why do we want to use this then? Well, it allows us a lot of flexibility in the studio as sonic artists and electroacoustic musicians. MIDI allows us to take a single controller of some sort, typically a piano style keyboard, and control multiple MIDI capable synthesizers. This means that a synthesizer head doesn't necessarily need to have its own piano controller. It could be controlled, and sound could be created with it by using the controller that a performer is most comfortable using. It essentially allows for a decoupling of the sound creation unit from the controller itself. This came about for a number of reasons, but essentially in the 70s and early 80s, manufacturers were all kind of in an arms race creating their own synthesizers. Many of them were wonderful, rich, warm analog sounds. But you had to have an individual controller for each synthesizer. There was no way of essentially having them talk to each other. So if you had a sequencer of some sort or some sort of piano style controller or something, it couldn't communicate with a different synthesizer, which starts to create constraints that are unnecessary. So manufacturers got together, created the MIDI Association, and came up with this specification for how you could send data from one device to another, essentially allowing for the communication between these things. Where this was really huge is in like some of these progressive rock bands, essentially that had giant walls of synthesizers and keyboards and controllers for each of them. They could reduce down the number of controllers while maintaining the same number of synthesizers. And then the performer essentially could have a single controller that could control multiple different types of synthesizers. And we'll get into how that can happen later. But for the moment, what exactly is a MIDI controller? Well, you might contemplate something as simple as just like a normal kind of piano keyboard. So this is an older M-Audio MIDI controller. It's got 25 kind of piano style keys. It's got some rotary knobs and a couple percussive type pads on it. And then in the back here, you're going to notice a couple of ports. There's a USB port kind of right there. And then next to it, you'll notice those 5-pin DIN connectors that say MIDI in, MIDI out. And that's the analog MIDI version. But nowadays, of course, our computer can talk to these MIDI controllers via USB. And that was an update of the specification in the 90s or early 2000s. I don't remember which. So there's a couple things I want you to know about MIDI. I've got a whole bunch of reading for you to do. It's going to take you a while, and I apologize about that, but it's important just to kind of read some of the historical documents on MIDI. But let's get over here real quick. Come here. And I'm going to move right there. Okay. So as I mentioned, MIDI essentially hold on, almost there. Okay. MIDI allows us to essentially have some sort of controller that can then talk to some sort of synth. And typically, we're going to think of this controller as kind of being a piano style keyboard with its various keys. That's almost like a keyboard. At any rate, right? And what happens in the specification is that a number of things are sent over, originally via binary. So kind of the early version or digital is based on a system where every bit or piece of data is represented either as a 0 or a 1. I'm sure you've heard that before. And in binary, what happens is we send over a series of zeros and ones, which when put together can create larger values. And in MIDI, essentially, we work with a system that gives us a total range in almost all parameters, although it's not entirely true, but in almost all parameters of 0 to, let's let me redo my 0 here, of 0 to 127, which of course equates to a total range of 128. Right, as an example, if we had a system of 0 to 3, that's actually equal to 4 values because we have 0, 1, 2, and 3, which are 4 unique values. So just know that MIDI has a total range of 128 values, essentially. Here, let me get out of some of that. Let me erase it away because I don't have enough. And I'm writing too big. Great. So we've got 128 values, as I mentioned, in the MIDI protocol. And what happens is that whenever we have a controller tell the synthesizer some sort of information, it's going to send over a number of pieces of data. And the first of these is going to be what's known as a note on message. And a note on message simply tells the synthesizer to start playing a note. And the synthesizer then will keep playing that note until it receives a note off message. So the two of these things together are rather important, this note on and note off message. And in addition to note on and note off, what happens with each of these? So when we send a note on message, we're going to send some sort of value that specifies what note to play. 60 is going to specify a value of middle C or C4, for those of you who know that. And so on the keyboard, of course, if I pressed and held the C key, and that was the middle C key, it would send a MIDI note value of 60. In addition to this note on and the message, the note number that is specified, we're also going to send over an initial attack or amplitude, again, in a range of 0 to 127. Amplitude. Almost looks like amplitude. When we turn off a note off, we're going to send over the same value. So if we had turned on 60, at some point, the synthesizer is going to expect to receive a note off message with that same 60 value. So the two of these things are really critical. They go together. And without the note off message, a synthesizer does not know to actually turn off the note that it's currently playing. There's a whole lot else with MIDI protocol that you're going to read about, but those are kind of the really big things I want you to take away from this. The last thing I want you to know is that in addition to being a communication protocol, MIDI also can be a file format. And the great thing about the file format is that's going to allow us to actually store sound or music information in a discretized format that's going to be far less size than a true audio file. It has its advantages and disadvantages, which we'll talk about a little bit later, but something to be aware of. So again, these are some very, very basic MIDI overviews, but a couple of the things I really want you to be aware of. Again, please read through all of the information down below and enjoy examining MIDI.